Afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this panel discussion. My name is Stephen Hill, and I'm going to be chairing the session this afternoon. And in this session, we're going to turn our thoughts to the future of responsible research assessment, and specifically to ask the question, what is the funder's role in supporting an inclusive research culture through setting policies and practice around research assessment? And I think this issue is really at the heart of what we mean by responsible research assessment that we've been discussing throughout this week. And it's a vital element in ensuring that we have a research system that's both open to and serves the whole of society. We have two fantastic panelists this afternoon, Dr. Karen Salt and Professor Londa Schiebinger, who I'll introduce fully in a moment. I'm then going to ask each of the panelists to present some opening remarks for 10 minutes each, and then open up for questions. So please enter your questions in the Q&A box. So let me now introduce our panelists. So first, Karen Salt is the Deputy Director of R&D, Culture and Environment within UK Research and Innovation, the UK's principal research funding agency. It's a policy area that includes cross-cutting topics such as research integrity and research culture. Karen brings to this role 27 years worth of experience working in and with communities, organisations, charities and governmental bodies. She's an expert on systems of governance and has managed large research teams and collaborated on a number of research projects, including those exploring trust and collective governance in technology. And she was formerly the director of the Centre for Research in Race and Rights based at the University of Nottingham in the UK. Londa Schiebinger is the John L. Hines Professor of History of Science at Stanford University and directs an EU-US programme on gendered innovations in science, health and medicine, engineering and the environment. She's a leading international expert on gender in science and technology. And over the past 30 years, her work has been devoted to teasing apart three analytically distinct but interlocking pieces of the gender and science puzzle: the history of women's participation in science, gender in the structure of scientific institutions, and the gendering of human knowledge. So I think you'll agree that we've got a real opportunity to hear from these experts and also to ask the questions that you're burning to ask about them on this really important topic. So now I'm going to hand over to Karen to make her opening remarks. Thank you, and Karen.
Thank you so much for that really kind introduction, Stephen. And I just want to welcome everyone. No matter what time it is or what holiday you are celebrating, it's a joy to be able to spend some time with you. I'm going to share my screen and take you through a few things, some of which I think we all probably know quite well as we work to sort of set up some of the questions and I think the conversations that Stephen has sort of outlaid for all of us. He has also hopefully given you some sense of the policy area that I cover within UK research and innovation. But one of the reasons why I'm delighted to be able to speak to all of you today is that when we think about R&D, culture and environment, at least within UKRI, we definitely think about the whole gamut of inclusion, integrity, criteria, excellence, the culture with which people work and strive in, as well as the benefits and the opportunities from things like open research and open access. And I have the pleasure of essentially leading and working with teams that work across that dynamic. And it's really very powerful to be able to draw upon their knowledge and to stimulate conversations and convene and work with others and colleagues like Stephen across UK research and innovation, because a number of these areas and a number of these issues really do sit at the heart of the conundrum that we're talking about, which is responsible research assessment. But really, we're really talking about the cultures with which this work kind of strives and emerges in. So I've got a few things to kind of talk through. Just trying to make sure that I'm going to just stop sharing for a quick moment. Bring you back in because it is playing. Yes, no. The beauty of this is it was working quite lovingly a few seconds ago, but now it is decided that it is done working, and I will get it together in a moment. Right, we're going to try this again. Huzzah, correct? We can see?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. So I'm going to just jump right in. And I think part of it is really trying to get a sense of what the lay of the land sort of looks like across the domain right now within responsible research assessment. So we have a whole host of guidance and sort of drivers of sort of policy change. And this isn't even the full list. You will be able to see a number of different resources and material that's available and that's out there to essentially be able to guide and inform. And what's been really interesting, started to think about this kind of crowded landscape, as I'm calling it now, is not necessarily that any of these things are bad or not, or that they are not helpful. It's just there's quite a few of them from a policy perspective. Some that are actual guidance, some that are actual policies, some that are a sense of kind of recommendations, and then a whole range of tools from the unintended cognitive and systems biases from DORA to the monitoring framework that Plan S has put together to really try to understand the impacts of Plan S across the system. And in that case, they're really quite interested in what will the work coming from Plan S actually impact DORA. And I'm starting with this actually, primarily to sort of to I think raise the awareness of we're not starting from a base of zero at this moment, right? There could have been a completely different conversation if we were 10, 15 years ago, but we're actually starting at a place where a whole range of different departments, fields, areas, communities, groups, institutions, and funders have set up these range of different sets of initiatives, sometimes seeing gaps in existing sets of policies and guidance, and then creating new ones, sometimes adding to existing ones. And ultimately trying to refine, if you will, the offer as we move forward. But what this has done, I suspect, is actually created, I'll just go back for a quick moment. What it's done, I suspect, is created actually a lot of different things. And as we now start to think about that future that Stephen has asked, that kind of next steps, I think we're going to need to do a couple of different things to try to assess and understand what's currently available that's in the system, and ultimately where we might ultimately go next, and how we might want to transform, especially as we bring all of the different parts of research and innovation or research and development globally along with us. So I thought I would just display to you a couple of different sort of slides that were compiled after we did a commission on interventions. We wanted to understand the actual effects of interventions around equality, diversity, and inclusion, both in the UK and the international context. And a number of partners did some useful assessments and gathering of that commissioned work. And so they've produced this kind of quick slide deck of what are the challenges and the issues around interventions. And I'm going to just present them both to you. One is an understanding of what makes an intervention successful. These are the things, if I were to look back at the list that was on the prior slide, I'd see a lot of that: collaboration, communication, gathering evidence to understand about the intervention, strategic alignment and drivers, that kind of learning, embedding, managing, accountability, community, resourcing this adequately across a whole bunch of the different sets of guidance and tools and information that's available around responsible research assessment. You do see quite a lot of these sets of tools and guidance and information, which is extremely positive to ultimately see. And I should say this comes from the EDIS community that essentially looked over the reviews that we made. But then they also did, in the same reviews, there's also information about what makes an intervention unsuccessful. And again, you know, this will be familiar to many of you. There's a lack of racial diversity of the participants. Well, I'd even stretch that to diversity of the participants in a large range of senses. A lack of resources and recognition. Sometimes the people who have to pick this up to try to do this work, the lack of ongoing support, inconsistencies within policies, or reluctance to adapt, the issues around data, sampling sizes, missing data, short timescales. This will be familiar to anyone who's tried to implement large-scale policy change and moving forward. There's a few things missing, even from the reviews and sets of information that we put together. And for me, these are the remaining challenges, I think, as a funder, but I think that throughout the whole system that we ultimately need to think about and ponder as we start to think about what is going to be this future. And I've been alluding to this in my little brief remarks so far, but there's lots of interventions. And it almost feels like there's a lot of noise in the system now. How do we assess and evaluate all these different sets of concrete acts and information so that we can understand what is impacting what, right? And then maybe how do we link these different drivers and levers? This conversation looks completely differently if you're a faculty or if you're an institution or if you're a funder. We all may have the same objective in the end, but we might have completely different drivers and levers that we might utilize. So how do we do evaluation and assessment? How do we try to link these things up? There's a second one that's really quite critical for me, and this is assurance mechanisms. We've got a couple of different challenges around assurance mechanisms in this space. One of them is essentially confidence that stuff is actually working. And the other one is the assurance mechanism that anyone who runs an organization will probably be involved in doing. So what's happening behind the scenes with all these different mechanisms and material and new assessment practices? What are the evidence-based risks? What's the assurance frameworks, the governance and delivery of these various models? Are we creating more bureaucracy and more inequity within our system in the back room? But yet the assessment process that might be happening as people come together might ultimately be moving forward that in a way that looks positive, but yet all the work or all the risk is sitting with one person in an organization. I'm really quite interested in this. I think this type of organizational change usually doesn't become one that people want to talk most about. They want to talk about the outcome at the end or the impact on the particular entities within the system, but they're not asking how does the system work and how do we ultimately try to deliver this type of change? Because for me, this is literally about sustainable change making. And that means I really do need to think what's happening in the funder, what's happening in the institution, and what's happening within particular sets of groups. And there's a third and fourth, they talk to each other a little bit. But the third one for me is the scalar challenges. We've got an incredible amount of innovation that is happening around responsible research assessment. We're doing some within UKRI with narrative CVs. I know there are tons of others who are also engaged in this. And there are loads of institutions and others who are thinking about different forms of criteria. But how do we then try to scale this work, right? How do we understand and distinguish the scale and the impact so that we can then transform multiple places as we're moving forward? And then that thorny fourth one, navigating different legal and policy frameworks. This is a big one. And we know this as we start to move from location to location when we start to think about some of these policy changes where I work in the UK with a particular legal structure, whereas I have colleagues in Germany or in other places where there are certain things they can't ask. There are certain things they actually can't get that data or that set of information, or they can't essentially categorize people in a particular way. And there are other places that don't even use that set of language. So if we actually start to think about bringing equity into the system or different forms of action to try to transform what does research assessment look like for particular groups that might be underrepresented within research and development. We now have to move into a place where we've got to really navigate this. And this is important for global and international collaboration, for us to recognize that the policy frameworks governing one location are not the policy frameworks that govern another location. But the question, the deep question, are what are the behaviors that get baked into that? So it's not necessarily just to get lost in the legal and the policy, but to start to think of the different behaviors, because we have an international system. And that means that we're going to have people who will collaborate with partners from multiple places, and people who will be quite mobile, and they will move to multiple places, and they may encounter completely new legal policy frameworks for them, although they've been in existence in that location. So how do we help our community? How do we help them to navigate and kind of understand these different sets of policy possibilities, policy demands, as well as policy challenges as we navigate kind of international connections and collaborations. So I'm going to leave you with that, and I'm hopeful as we start to move into particular sets of interventions or particular things that we could do, or people start sharing about things that they have been engaged in within the questions you might pose, or questions that Stephen might pose to Londa and I, that we also start to think about a number of these much more systems-based work that I've put forward to you. Because if we want to start instituting some of these much more across the board, it's the set of things that we're going to now need to start thinking about. It's that next stage for me for the future of this work, so that we can give really good guidance to organizations about embedding this change going forward. So over to you, Stephen.
Thank you very much, Karen. Really interesting and thought-provoking comments. Let's move straight on to Londa.
All right, let me share my screen. All right. So I'm taking up one of the questions that was posed for this session. How can funders support an inclusive research culture in the future? To support an inclusive research culture, funders need to work at 3 levels. The first is fix the numbers. So we need equality. Funders need to foster equality, diversity, and inclusion in research careers and in decision-making. This is about building teams. Who's doing the research? The second level is fix the institutions. Institutions need to be transformed so that careers can flourish for men, women, for gender diverse people, and for people from diverse social and cultural backgrounds. Then we need to fix the knowledge. Fixing the knowledge supports inclusive research. And my remarks today will focus completely on this number 3, how research is conducted. And here you as funders have a large impact. The key question is, how can we harness the creative power of sex, gender, and intersectional analysis for innovation and discovery? Does considering these factors add valuable dimensions to research? Do they take research in new directions? So integrating sex, gender, and intersectional analysis into research enhances excellence and reproducibility in science and technology. It stimulates innovation and creativity and fosters social equality by ensuring that research results benefit the whole of society and not just one sector. So here's what you need to know. Yesterday, the European Commission released what we call Gendered Innovations 2, How Inclusive Analysis Contributes to Research and Innovation. It's the how-to. It's the methods. Well, specifically, we have, inclusive analysis is sex, gender, and or intersectional analysis. And I'll say what that means in a minute. We have 15 new case studies, which are examples of how these factors enhance excellence in science. And we have new and revised methods, practical methods that people can employ. And the new thing in this, as opposed to gendered innovation 1, is that we have field-specific methods. And for AI, for instance, one of our methods is analyzing gender and intersectionality in machine learning, that sort of thing. So you can get right to your area. Then this will all be on our website about December 1st or so. And you should also know that the website, I think funders should know that this website hosts a list of public funding agencies and their policies on integrating sex, gender, and intersectional analysis into research. So if your agency isn't listed here, you probably need to develop such policies, or if you have policies and if we've missed them, then please do send me an email. And the big announcement yesterday from the European Commission is that sex, gender, and sex and gender analysis will be mandatory for public funding in Horizon Europe. And this is very interesting. Before it was just a suggestion, a please do it sort of thing. And this will be reviewed, evaluated under the excellence criteria. And a new thing that is coming, just launched between Gendered Innovations and EDIS. I saw Lillian Hunt on an earlier slide, and she is my collaborator here. We are doing a global review of sex, gender, and intersectional analysis in research policies for major public granting agencies. We have just launched a pilot of that and are reviewing 6 public agencies right now to see how our instrument is working. And if that all is fine, we will evaluate 50 agencies across 6 continents and rank, evaluate funding agencies, somewhat like the global ranking of universities. Our purpose is to highlight the best policies by leading edge agencies that can serve as models for others. So we seek to offer a clear roadmap for improvement. Now let's dive into what some of this means. What do I mean by gender, sex, and intersectional analysis? So by now, you are all familiar with how doing research wrong costs lives and money. Programs and engineered systems fail, and they fail more often for women and people of color. So let's zoom through some of these examples, and I was asked to talk about machine learning, AI kind of stuff. So this is a well-known example. In Google search, men are 5 times more likely than women to be offered ads for high-paying executive jobs. Why is that? It's because the algorithm, which Google has set up to get the right ad to the right person, sees in the data that men make more money. There's a global gap in wages. The algorithm sees that and then assumes that it should give ads for high-paying jobs more often to men. So Google can fix that. They can't fix the data necessarily, but they can fix the algorithm. So we know that. In health technology, it's very interesting that soap dispensers don't work well for people with darker skin. I'm sure you've seen these viral videos where white-skinned person puts their hand under the soap dispenser, gets soap. Person with darker skin puts their hand under the soap dispenser, gets nothing. So there's a near infrared technology there that doesn't detect the person with darker skin. So this is important. It is the same technology works in heart monitors, so that very often people with darker skin are at risk for serious conditions such as heart disease because the instrument cannot measure what's going on in their bodies. And extremely important now, having to do with COVID, is that pulse oximeters, you may have one at home, these cheap little things that measure the oxygen levels in your blood, but in hospitals, pulse oximeters overestimate the oxygen saturation in patients with darker skin, meaning that they may not get supplemental oxygen when they need to. And in the US, all of that is tied to insurance, when the insurance company will pay for supplemental oxygen. So it's a very serious thing. that the technology is not working for everyone equally and well across the board. Another example is predictive models in genetic medicine. We know GWAS, the genome-wide association studies, are very important. In the US, 80% of the participants in GWAS are of European descent. So the predictors may not be valid for other ancestries. These need to be validated before they are deployed, and I'm afraid they're not happening yet. So each of these examples is important, but what did you notice about them? Too bad we can't have a little question answer here. Each example focuses on one social dimension in isolation, either gender with the Google search or race with the pulse oximeter. But what we need is to go to a higher level problem, and that is intersectionality. So intersectionality describes the overlapping or intersecting forms of discrimination related to gender, sex, ethnicity, age, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, geographic location. There are many of these. The term was coined in 1989 by the legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw to describe how multiple forms of discrimination interact. So let me show you how this works in facial recognition. This is work by Joy Buolamwini, and it's called Gendered Shades. She has a great video online, a 5-minute video. I don't have time to show it, but it's good for showing to students or anyone whom you want to understand this very quickly. So Gender Shades studies how sex and gender interact, and this study found that facial recognition doesn't work for Black women, especially. It cannot see Black women's faces. So there's the sex analysis. Number one, the system performs better on men's faces than women's faces. There's the race analysis. Number two, the system performed better on lighter skin than on darker skin. But the intersectional analysis shows us that the system performed the worst for Black women with an error rate of 35%, whereas for darker skinned, I can't see because of this, for darker skinned men, it was 12%, so it sees men better, but less good. For lighter skinned women, 7% error rate. And of course, for lighter skinned men, only a 1% error rate. So this is what intersectionality is about, to see how some people are especially disadvantaged by a particular technology. But wait, there's more with facial recognition. You could do a sexuality analysis. The system can't recognize transgender faces, especially during transition periods. And then we can also do a gender analysis. Facial cosmetics reduce the accuracy of facial recognition up to 76%. Good to know, because facial recognition is often used when you're going through the airport, especially for international airport changes. So gendered innovations, all of this is geared for solutions. I don't have time to tell you how the Gender Shades group devised an inclusive data set which improved the facial recognition use. And Gendered Innovations, my organization, also has many workshops, and we're looking for solutions. We did a machine learning workshop in 2018, had 2 Nature articles on it and 2 case studies that you can look at. So let me add about especially facial recognition, getting the data right and making technology see everyone is one aspect of the problem with facial recognitions. But there's larger issues such as security. Transgender people, for instance, maybe facial recognition doesn't work for them, but they may not want to be tracked by facial recognition. So the potential misuse of facial recognition has led Belgium, for example, to declare facial recognition illegal. France and Sweden have prohibited it from schools. Cities like San Francisco don't allow it to be used by law enforcement, and companies are also pulling back. IBM has left the facial recognition business entirely, and Amazon will not allow its product to be used by the police in response to the worldwide protests against systematic racism and injustice in 2020. So long-term solutions in this space are something like the US Algorithmic Justice League, which is called for the creation of national offices, such as the US FDA, to regulate some of these technologies like facial recognition. So in conclusion, there are many resources for sex and gender and intersectional research. There's the new Gendered Innovations 2 report that I told you about. For health science, we have 3 beautiful online courses from the Canadian Institutes of Health. The National Institutes of Health in the US just offered 4 online courses for resources. What we don't have are online courses for AI and machine learning, and that we sorely need. So you can sign up for the latest examples in this space on the Gendered Innovations website if you'd like to. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Londa. That's a really interesting and timely reminder about the important aspects of research excellence that sometimes get ignored and thankfully now are being brought more to the fore. So I'm going to move now to questions. We've got some questions lined up, but while you ponder and think about your questions, I'm just going to kick off with one of my own for both the panelists. So when we think about inclusivity in research assessment, there is a tendency to think in terms of equality, so leveling the playing field, making the playing field level, rather than equity, making sure that everyone has what they need to play. So Karen, Londa, what do you think we can do to bring more of an equity focus to our research assessments? Karen first.
Great, and a good challenging question, I think. Part of it, I think, is to revisit and rethink what we're trying to do. And a number of years ago, I hazard to throw up a number, but a number of years ago, we would have said at one point in time, you know, it's great to give opportunities to X amount of people to be able to come into research and innovation. And again, not too long ago, we would have had places where it might have actually been illegal or difficult to even try to go and get an education at maybe particular sets of universities because of the restrictions for certain groups to actually be admitted. And as you travel the world and you see these sort of stories and you hear these sort of situations, equality of opportunity, you know, it had a very significant purpose, and actually trying to create doorways, if you will, for people to come in. But I've been talking for a long time about equity. And part of it for me is the fact that we just assume that the doorway looks the same for everyone, right, when they come up to the door. And we assume that if they walk through it, on the other side, that the system recognizes exactly what they offer, the same as they would anybody else. And neither of those two things are true. That doorway might look like a football field, every type of football field for our audience, for people walking up to it. And so they don't even know how to walk through it, much less the fact that if they walk through whatever doorway might be there, you know, we have a whole set of different ways that people are then regarded and looked at. So that criteria shifts suddenly, where it might look one way for someone with X background, suddenly the criteria for what excellence looks like drifts into something else completely for another group. Or they feel like they have to work twice as hard, or have a doubled list of grants to be able to move forward. And that's where we have to now start thinking quite a lot about equity. What is it about the differences in terms of where people start, the ways that they experience interacting within a particular environment, and the stuff that's baked in our system, right? The stuff that's baked into the way we function. That's not necessarily anything special about research and innovation or research and development. If I travel the world, I can go into various countries and locations and often try to find marginalized people. and folks who will never be leaders of a political party. They will never necessarily be. It'll be a long time, right? Everyone feels like that's a hurdle that would be very difficult to make those sets of changes. So it's not that there's a fixed group that sits in those locations. It means that if we really are creating an inclusive environment where there are no doors for people to walk into, right? The environment is open for everyone, and there is no sort of model or supra type that we've got in our head for who should be the person doing this set of work. For us to ultimately do that, we actually need to then be able to understand those differences about those experiences, but also the ways that we might be doing sets of things that we don't even need a policy and a law now that might tell us, I'm not too sure if this is the right environment for that person, right? We've challenged this now at employment. We challenge this when we get people together to talk about these things about fit, right? The fit with teams, or the fit with particular cultures or groups. But we may still practice it in a way that, okay, that meeting might work, that assessment moment, but every day that person might walk through that building and still get the message that they don't belong, right? It could be really subtle. So there's quite a lot of work, I think, around equity. And I would just really challenge the community listening to not necessarily think it's the equity in a singular process and it's a singular event and then you're good. It is actually trying to live that ethos every single day within your structures and within your systems, so that it just bleeds into that, so it becomes equitable practice all the time.
Thank you. Londa, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I would extend Karen's excellent, wonderful last statement, especially a little further. I see three kinds of diversity and equity that funding agencies, universities, peer reviewed journals need. So there's the teams or the participants that Karen was talking about. There's the methods that are recognized and used. And there's also the questions asked. Mm-hmm. So if we ask a new set of newcomers to come into institutions and they're forced into the same questions, what is science, right? They're forced to ask the same kinds of questions that we've always been asking. So we need to open up what knowledge is and recognize new questions. I can tell you that the whole gender thing, when I was in graduate school, I was told that anything on gender was professional suicide. Well, so they were super wrong, but nonetheless, that was the knowledge. So when we welcome diverse groups, we really have to listen carefully to what agenda they're bringing. And funders especially need to make sure in their calls for proposals that they are capturing the new interests, the new questions, the new kinds of methodologies.
Thank you. Yeah, and that point about funding calls leads me very nicely into the next question, which is from one of the participants in the session, who's asked what are the practical ways that funders can incentivize an inclusive research culture through how they deliver funds. For example, what type of projects it funds, or whether it assesses the research environment. So Londa, do you want to carry on with that thread and respond to that question?
Yeah, sorry, I had a distraction in the room. Sorry, could you just...
What are the practical ways that funders can incentivize an inclusive research culture through how it delivers funds, for example, in what types of projects it funds?
Yeah, Karen may have a better answer to that. So one of the things that's really going on with funders is a concern about the ethics of the research. This is especially true for machine learning or AI. So funders now look at the excellence, the techniques, the methodology, that sort of thing. But we have a funder here at Stanford, the Human-Centered AI Institute, and we've just implemented an ethics review board. So sometimes research has to go through an institutional review board to make sure that you have consent and all that sort of thing. But now there's the new ethics review board to look in advance at the impact of the funding on society and making sure, not just thinking about the equality of the participants, but the equality of the impact of the research. Will it empower everyone? Is it going to harm a certain group of people? So I think this is a huge opportunity for funders and very necessary.
Yeah, and that in the European context, that's often talked about in the context of responsible research and innovation, and how that's where we got the notion of responsible research assessment, was by analogy with that. So that's a kind of interesting tie-up. Karen, do you have any thoughts on that, about what types of projects should be funded to foster a more inclusive culture?
Yeah, I think I think the questioner for leading us into this direction, and it'll pick up. What I'll say will pick up a few things that I think Londa's started with, and I think one of them is that idea of what is knowledge and information, right? And what are ideas, and what do they look like, and what do they generate? And there's something quite interesting when you start to have what we might claim is a successful model, which is somebody invests, you get a return, that return has some sort of impact somewhere. And in a number of assessments and sort of situations, we would say that's good, right? There's a good return, everybody's happy, life moves on. The government or whoever has supplied that money would say the job is done here. What our challenge, I think, is that we're really wanting to make sure that the people who are participating in that, it's the widest group absolutely possible, that the teams that are involved in that is, again, the widest group possible, not just the ones directly doing the research in an institution, but maybe the community researchers, the archivists, the librarians, all these folks that are actually there and kind of a part of that system, as well as the impacts and where that work might go. But there's like a third layer on top of all of that, which is then about the actual the research itself, and what is ultimately being asked. And within UK research and innovation, we've had loads of conversations, and they're ramping up once again, but we're hearing them from the community about ultimately, are we driving down innovation in some ways, and not us necessarily as a funder, but potentially our peer reviewers or our communities, because they're now looking for the type, right? They're looking for the thing that is the sure bet, the thing that they can get through, the thing that will deliver. Remember back to that's really simplistic model that will deliver that. Whereas it's not even that it needs to be high risk. It's just that they're looking at these things, and they're trying to evaluate and ask these questions. And I think as kind of funders and kind of guardians and protectors and supporters of the system, we've got to help encourage the system to be bold, and encourage the system to be brave, and encourage it to also not to move into sameness. Where it starts to see the same sets of projects and the same sets of things as being the ones that will tick the right box at the end. And that means we probably need be a bit more confident with the people who supply that money to us about what the return is for that sort of investment and that kind of creativity, right? And that sort of innovation. Because I think that can go a long way to be able to create the conditions. There's a whole set of things around gap analysis and really understanding what's there, and getting lots of people to be able to feed into that, and actually start to think about how we fund, and not necessarily just the what, but the how. But I think, I'll leave it at that to hopefully we have a time for a few more questions.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, because essentially we're saying that there's a problem, or you're saying there's a problem with stereotypes. And that might be stereotyping people, but it's also stereotyping research and research topics, and putting them into preconceived categories in advance. And I think that's a really interesting analogy. We're coming close to the time, but we've got quite a few more questions to get through. So let's push on and see whether we can get through at least a couple more. So the next question is about the crowded policy landscape that you talked about, Karen, in your opening comments, and asking for suggestions about how funders might prioritize initiatives around the assessment, and what their priorities should be. And I'm going to throw in a kind of another angle to that as well, because one of the other things about this crowded landscape is, part of the reason it's crowded is because there are community-driven bottom-up initiatives. And so how do we manage those community-driven and bottom-up initiatives, which will bring about change? They are the sorts of things that bring about change. But how do we get strategic about that? And I guess the prioritization question is about how do you get strategic when you're allowing 1,000 flowers to bloom? So Londa, do you want to tackle that one? And I'll come back to Karen in a moment.
Great.
Yeah, I think this idea that you have to appreciate new questions. It's not just about bringing in new people, but listening to the kinds of projects they want to propose. So as funders, well, I don't know, in our U.S. National Science Foundation, PIs propose what they want to work on. And if it's too new, no one recognizes it as something that's worthwhile. So we have to be more careful about recognizing and being open to new questions.
Yeah, Karen, how do you?
Yeah, I think you've raised the delicious conundrum, I think, which is, how do we not stop conversation and challenge and critique and really bringing all different types of groups together, whether or not it's, actual researchers and innovators on the ground all the way through to institutions, because I think that is a vital, exciting way to really raise critique and questions, and it's to be commended. But we've got two other problems that have been coming out of a whole set of different sets of work that people have been doing. And I think the first one is an increasing demand from either that bottom up or even the top down to actually change all funding policies to reflect the conversations that people have had. And there just becomes a moment where those policies can get to the point where they become incomprehensible if they're trying to target everything. And we're not doing, I think, enough evaluation and assessment of any one singular one, much less if they're all there in the same environment trying to work. Do they end up having a knock-on effect? And so you get no change at all because there's so many different pieces that are moving and shifting. So I'm looking at this going, how do we get some clarity? Not necessarily just, I want to prioritize through the list of which one is most important, but I actually want to enable change to happen within the sector and the system. So actually, how do I bring these parts together? How do I let them talk to each other? How do I actually think about what I was saying about those assurance mechanisms? How do I find out what's happening in the back rooms or in the paper that people are keeping around all of these? And we don't do that enough. We don't sit as all the different holders of all these different manifestos and all these different documents and ask these simple questions from just a research perspective. What's been the uptake? What's been the buy-in? What's been the workload? What's been the impact? How much material are we generating within all of this? And what's the change, right? What is the change we want? And what's the change that we're ultimately seeing? So I think if we actually did a bit more of that, we might actually be able to streamline stuff and actually find out that actually a number of these documents and things are asking similar versions of the same question. And we might be able to just ask one. And then in certain instances, we might find that actually we've moved on from certain things. They're really good and they were purposeful to drive a moment, but actually the evolution of them into something else is a positive thing. So letting something go doesn't actually negate it of being brilliant. You just recognize it served its time to stimulate the system to move forward. But we don't do a lot of that either. We don't put stuff to bed. So then we end up with a lot more stuff just kind of sitting in the system. So I think this is a very healthy conversation to have versus one where people should start feeling uncomfortable, but in terms of moving things over or ultimately seeing how stuff is transitioned. I think it just will allow us to be healthy policymakers and give really good advice to our community.
Yeah, thank you. We're over time, but I'm gonna try and sneak in one more question because we're having such a good and fruitful discussion. So the next question that I've got is asked what are the particular challenges coming from the increasingly competitive nature of research funding, particularly around equality and inclusion. So Londa, do you want to take that one? Are there particular challenges that you think that competition is providing?
Oh, well, that's a hard one. So it's good if we have more diverse people asking for funding. That's great. I think that we have to open up with many different types of projects that we're funding, so that we give a lot of opportunity for the new people who are applying for the funding. So I'm not exactly sure how we would. It's always competitive. I mean, right now it's extremely competitive because the funding is going into keeping us alive with COVID rather than into research, but we can't forget the research, or ultimately it's not helpful.
And Karen, your thoughts on competition and the challenges for equality and inclusion?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really big, massive question, but I'll try to, I'll maybe segment it just a little bit, just so that it's manageable for time. I think one of the things that we can do around the competitive aspects, and I completely appreciate and acknowledge and support Londa's statements about people are bidding in for funding, and so in some ways we're not talking about being able to not have that process, although we do acknowledge that there are funders who do different forms of allocating globally, where it's not necessarily done by competition, but that being said, one thing that we could try to do a little bit more is bring in different ways of funding. We could think a bit more about the teams, for example, and remove less pressure on people being PIs. We could actually fund in different ways. I think as we start to think of collaboration, and I even know some universities in the UK that are thinking of collegiality as a central component of promotion, and that's not service. They're not thinking of service as that part of collegiality. They're really thinking about leadership in terms of teams, and that may be stuff that we can start to do on a more subtle basis, or even a more bold basis, that I think can start to kind of tip that competition language and that competition work into a slightly different direction. Because again, I think there's some aspects of it that just within the models I work in, I won't be able to make disappear. But I think if we start to change some of the conditions and some of the interactions, and not necessarily just some of the assessment aspects of it, I think we could change the way people go about it, and the way that they interact with each other. But it's going to take quite a lot of work, I think, to change those behaviors. And we should really focus on those incentives that are driving some of that in the system.
Yeah, that's a really inspiring point to end, I think, to think about how we can tackle some of these questions around competition, and use competition in different ways, or think about the ways it's framed in order to bring about change. So I think that's been an absolutely fascinating session. I could certainly carry on talking about this stuff for another 45 minutes, but I guess we have to limit ourselves to the time of the schedule, having already gone over a little bit. So just before we close, I just want to say two thank yous. One thank you to the people who you haven't seen, who've been behind the scenes, keeping the tech going and making sure the questions get fed through. So thank you to them. And finally, of course, thank you to our panelists who have lived up to all my expectations. Have been absolutely fantastic. Thank you to Karen Salt and Londa Schiebinger, and thank you all to listening and participating in the session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Yes. Bye.